and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Justin Fay, and I'm the Chief Advocacy Officer here at Fresh Energy, and also your host today. I'm excited to be joined by my colleagues Bryn Kersling, Director of Legislative and Grassroots Advocacy, and Jackson Sweeney, Session Associate. Welcome to you both. How are you both doing on this rainy Tuesday?
I'm enjoying it. I'm excited to see what comes next at the legislature. And I don't know, we get a little bit of a lull here to take a breath and probably dive back into some more work.
Yeah, feeling pretty similarly, just getting a feel for everything that has happened and what is still left to do at the legislature.
And there's quite a bit that's left, as I think we're going to discuss in a minute. So we're here today to debrief the regular session of the 2025 Minnesota Legislature. Regular is an important caveat there. Before we dive in, however, let's start with some introductions. So Jackson and Bryn, I'm wondering if you could introduce yourselves and say a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, I'm Jackson Sweeney. I'm the session associate with Fresh Energy here this year. And I like to say that my role is whatever the public affairs team says that they need to get done, I make sure they get it done. So that's getting testimony in, that's, setting meetings up with our legislative partners, coordinating all those logistical ins and outs that are required of helping the team run really effectively during the legislative session.
And like Justin said, I'm Bryn Kersling. I'm our Director of Legislative and Grassroots Advocacy. And what that means is I'm kind of day to day at the Capitol, attending hearings, going to those legislator meetings, making sure that our policy team is well represented and making our case, and then navigating how policy moves through committee and ultimately gets passed.
Awesome. Well, welcome to you both. And I also want to give a shout out to everyone on our Capitol team here at Fresh Energy this year. In addition to Brennan Jackson, so we worked with a great team, also including Ethan Culver, our Senior Associate for Coalitions and Campaigns, John Burns, our longtime contract lobbyist. John's been with Fresh Energy for over a decade. We're really lucky to have him. And our Capital Pathways intern, Armando, who is a McAllister student and is just wrapping up his internship with us this week. All of them were really critical parts of our team this year, and really proud of the work that we all were able to do together. So let's kick off with a really hard question. We're just going to come out swinging here. Bryn, Jackson, what is your favorite food truck at the Minnesota State Capitol?
Hands down, Nanny's Jamaican Kitchen. Absolutely phenomenal. You get a whole plate, you get some fried plantains. Absolutely the best. Highly recommend.
I'm also going to have to add to that, Egg Roll Queen is a perennial favorite down at the Capitol and sort of a secondary honorary mention to the many food trucks that also offer birria, which is a little bit dangerous to order when wearing like full business attire at the Capitol, but
You gotta live
always
dangerously
delicious.
though. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I have to, I didn't get to spend much time at the Capitol this year like you two did, but I have to make a courtesy shout out to my personal favorite, the Cave Cafe, which is a great little food truck. And they always specialize my order to my specifications, which, I appreciate.
Yeah, I think there's like a Blue Sky account with what are the food trucks on the strip. It's pretty cool.
Hashtag Capitol Food Truck Brigade.
There you go.
For those of you listening, this is a really big deal in the lives of people that work at the Capitol. The session starts every year in like January or February, and it's the dead of winter, and the only food on at the Capitol are these incredibly generic cafeterias that are always super crowded. And then, like, right as the weather gets nice, food trucks start coming to the Capitol, and it's like it feels like being rescued. It's an incredible feeling.
It really lifts spirits up as the session goes on, and more trucks start to show up. It's a really there's energy both in the Capitol and outside when the food trucks arrive.
You need that mid-marathon fuel.
Well, speaking of fuel, we are here to talk about energy today. So I want to ground us in some of the policy arc of the work that we do at Fresh Energy. Um, the last few years, we've had some pretty big shifts, both in our politics and in just the policy landscape for energy in Minnesota and around the world. Um,
Yeah, I don't,
Brian,
I
oh,
think
sorry, go ahead.
everybody knows the major shifts at the federal level, right? We probably don't need to say too much about, some major policy shifts from one administration to the next. And that's the context that, we're working under, and Fresh Energy is navigating those waters. But then at the state level, right, we're seeing sort of historic context for how we navigate legislation this year. So those are kind of the major points to start off with.
Yeah, and I think too, if you look at just the global context of everything, investments in clean energy last year hit the $2 trillion mark when they had only crossed 1 trillion the year prior. Our colleague Kwesi Tabaro shared this with us. He's doing a lot of research in those clean energy investments on a global scale. And I think it's really impactful to see just how much funding is going into clean energy, the direction we're headed. And it's not only on the investment side, everyday people are wanting their lawmakers to act on climate and act on clean energy movement. The Yale program on climate change communication has done some extensive research and polling, and around 70% of, people in America are wanting their legislators to act on climate. So we're seeing a lot of movement and momentum, not only in investments, but also public support as well on clean energy and climate action.
Yeah, thanks for outlining that, Jackson. It's that gives me a lot of like hope and momentum, and you see it in our work. I think sometimes it's hard to see in that day-to-day grind. But I know what we're really good at Fresh Energy is like doing really well in that day-to-day, but seeing the scope of like 5 and 10 years. And the energy transition can't be stopped. Like what you just outlined is like exponential momentum, and that the technology advancement is undeniable. The momentum has taken hold, and we're meeting the moment, even if we have some of these hard fought moments and some difficult sticky things to work through. The overall momentum is on our side.
Well, that's a really great note, Brent. It's easy, especially when you're reading the news, to sort of feel those like pangs of despair. But when you kind of lay it all out, the public support, the policy trajectory, what the market's doing, like all the indicators continue to point in the direction of clean energy and a cleaner economy. And it really, it's not an if, it's a when. We're quibbling over how fast the inevitable is going to happen. Maybe just drilling down a little bit, we do just have a recently completed legislative session here in Minnesota. But we'll talk a little bit more about exactly what's happening, and maybe offer a quick disclaimer here that as we jump into the conversation, that we're recording this on Tuesday in May, right after the conclusion of the regular session. If you're listening to this, weeks from now, some of the conversation may not be current. So just be aware of that as we progress through the conversation, that this is we're doing today as a snapshot in time. But Bryn, I'm wondering if maybe you'd be willing to set the landscape for us a little bit. Like, what coming into the session, what did it look like? What were we expecting?
Yeah, are we tired of the word historic yet? It really is kind of an interesting set of circumstances. There's 100 Republicans and 101 Democrats between the chambers, and it makes everything harder and more complicated. Something that I thought was interesting in navigating this session was that sort of such narrow margin really magnifies like the different subsets in each of those political parties, and not everything is so cut and dry, and you really do have to like navigate specific personalities and more deeper like homegrown interests to sort of form the right voting blocks and support and momentum. And I think the big board at the end that has all the like red and green votes doesn't tell the whole story about like how complicated those relationships can be, especially in those tight margins. So that's kind of what we're navigating through between the House and the Senate.
And it definitely wasn't even easy to get to 100 Republicans and 101 Democrats. There was a lot of uphill work just to even get things moving at the legislature this year. We had various special elections to fill a variety of seats. One very near and dear to the hearts of many legislators was the passing of Senator Carrie Diedzig, filling her seat in Minneapolis. But we also had a member who maybe had some issues on the campaign front in their residence, and so had to step down before they were seated. And we saw a lot of push and pull dynamics, and DFL legislators didn't come to the first several weeks in protest. There was a lot of moving dynamics of getting to a power sharing agreement between House Republicans and House DFL members. And even in the Senate during their temporary tie before the special election, I think they wanted to show that they were the more civilized body, came to a power sharing agreement very quickly. And following those special elections, seating of members, we were finally able to get to those counts, but it definitely wasn't easy to get there by any means.
Yeah, I think there's never been a time where we've had two special elections during session. I think there's been one, but never like two. I'd have to fact check that. But in any case, it's giving us context that most of us have never seen in our work. And changing week to week, changing power dynamics week to week was certainly an interesting way to sort of move our agenda. And the other thing I think I'll mention, again, tight margins magnifies everything. And another thing that we really appreciate is all of our partnerships in community, and being able to coordinate with different groups who are also at the Capitol and have similar interests, and making sure we're on the same page, because being aligned and forward looking in these tight of situations, and now we see at the end of session how quickly things moved, and having all those relationships and partnerships, having good dialogue and communication was so essential to know what was happening. I think we'll probably tell some stories that outline that through this podcast, but the turnaround time sometimes is in hours, not days, and all of those strategic partnerships really make those moments work.
It all really comes back to relationships, doesn't it? The so I with the kind of disclaimer that I already shared about we're at a moment in time. So to be more precise, as we're recording this, it's 9:28 a.m. the morning after the regular session has concluded, as I'm about to ask this next question. But for folks that might be listening at home in the next day or two, Bryn, what do we know?
Not a ton. If I want to admit it, there is a lot happening behind closed doors. I think we said, towards the end of session, right, the rooms get smaller and smaller and smaller. But what we do know is that there is a budget deal, and it's been constantly up and down. I don't know if you watched the close of session last night, but there was, some interesting procedural votes. some things that were kind of unexpected. So, we see this, I think it was like the May 15th press conference that was like, oh, there's a deal. It's way more complicated than that. And I think a handful of omnibus bills were passed, some conference committee reports were passed, but not everything. And I think there's a lot of sticking points. This is where like our energy policy all of a sudden like meets the bigger world, and we are now in the big global negotiation, where our issues are mixed in with everything else. And like I said, the room gets really small. It is the governor and a handful of leaders. So I think we're all very hopeful that they can work this out. But with all the aforementioned nuanced dynamics of the legislature this year in particular, it's not really surprising that it was a slower finish, and they didn't quite get things done on time.
Yeah, definitely a lot still for them to get done. About 10% of the budget was passed before the end of the regular session, and they passed 9 of the 20 bills that were in omnibus bills that were in conference committee. Some of the big ones that they were able to get over the finish line before the end of regular session include the housing bill, judiciary and public safety, the state government and elections bill. Those are some of the really big highlights, but there's also a lot that's outstanding. Health and Human Services, K-12 education. Those are really big pieces of the state budget that still have to get ironed out. And leadership has indicated that these conference committees of, individual committee leadership will shift to become working groups. They're slated to be back down at the Capitol today. They have a deadline of Wednesday at 5 p.m. Otherwise, bills are in the hands of leadership. And then that's really going to dictate what a special session looks like and what the timing is on things. So there's plans in place, but something we know about the legislature is things don't always go to plan. So we'll definitely see what comes of these, negotiations.
Yeah, and as of now, we don't have, a date or time for special session. So, that will be up to the governor, and a couple just deadlines to outline here. They have to pass all of it. We have to call a special session and pass all of this by June 30th. Otherwise, there would be well, I guess at this point, like a partial government shutdown for things that have not passed. So, I think Jackson, what you outlined is those things, are in good standing for the next 2 years. Um, but there's still a lot of work to get done here.
Well, speaking of work, Fresh Energy and our supporters and partners work very, very hard during the session to elevate clean energy, climate, clean transportation, science and data and all that good stuff that candidly might not get the airtime it needs and deserves from policymakers if we weren't pushing so hard. Bryn, you elevated and mentioned our partners a few minutes ago, and I think that's a really important thing for folks listening to understand is that we're one part of a pretty robust ecosystem of folks that work not just on climate but on transportation and on so many other issues that are with the goal of serving the public interest. But we're also, I think, as an organization, having to frequently, scratch and claw a little bit to make sure that the issues we work on get the attention and consideration that they need. So Jackson, I think in your role this year, you were really in a lot of ways the front lines for Fresh Energy in terms of how we showed up at the legislature. Wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work and some of the results that you saw from Fresh Energy and how we, some of those things we did to cut through the noise and make sure we were heard.
Yeah, so much of my work this year was really focused on tracking policies that were coming up throughout the session and finding those opportunities, speaking with our policy staff on, is this something Fresh Energy wants to show up on? Is this a new area for us, or is this a long-standing issue we've been engaged on, and how do we approach that in this current dynamic? And we really showed up this year. We had 12 times throughout the session we testified in person. That was from 6 different staff people. We submitted 39 letters of testimony throughout the session, which is a lot. And, 8 different staff people working on making sure that Fresh Energy's voice is really present at the Capitol, moving some of those letters of testimony into conversations and meetings with legislators or partner organizations, and being able to identify some of those inroads and connections that we can foster on improving legislation or defending progress that we've made.
And this is where I have to give you a shout out, Jackson, because the keeping track of all of these moving pieces, like I said, 24-hour turnaround at times, and we need to respond that quickly. Couldn't have done it without you.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, and I think another shout out to one of our team members, credit to Ethan Culver, who was kind of in the driver's seat of doing a lot of Action Network work. And we have over 3,000 individuals in the Action Network, and over 1,000 of them receiving text messages. There's, I think, over 300 people who are new just this session. So if you're listening, welcome. And if you haven't signed up yet, make sure you sign up for our text alerts, so you can be part of that rapid response. The result was, over 1,200 messages sent to state legislators, and nearly 300 messages to the governor across a bunch of different topics, which we'll kind of get into detail later. But yeah, what else am I missing? Oh, we got a bill in the hopper this year too. It was great on geothermal planning grants. That was kind of an extension of our work last biennium. And we'll get into detail on that later. But yeah, I think we were all over the place at the Capitol.
Well, I think we're going to drill down in a second here to talk about some of the specific issues. But I think, hearing all this work and sort of just reflecting on what it all means, right? Like, we had really, really big wins in 2023 and 2024. As we sit here at the end of the 2025 session, those policies are intact, and the momentum that we built coming out of those sessions is still there. So, it's sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that when you're like in the trenches and you're sort of, you have to focus on the thing that they're doing in the moment, because that's your job. But we're actually winning like pretty hardcore, and there's not really anything they can do about it.
It's all momentum. Yeah, I think that's a great thing to outline too, Justin. Like, even, those moments where we passed 100%, we had these huge wins. That's like a 10-year arc of work. It's not just the moment it passes, that's where everything happened. There's so much work leading up to that. So some of this session was like making the case and sticking by it and creating a platform for another one of those like monumental moments.
Absolutely.
And I
Well,
think too,
go ahead.
there were so many more members that were speaking about climate and energy this year that hadn't been engaged on the issue previously. And, just from sitting in committee hearings and seeing members that might sit on housing or other committees that aren't directly focused on energy, but bringing up a lot of those clean energy policy issues, bringing those to the forefront of committee discussions where they hadn't been engaged on the issue in the past was really amazing to see. And I think speaks to that feeling of momentum and feeling that the tent is getting bigger and we're getting more people to be able just to speak really comfortably and with authority on some of these issues, especially lawmakers who are wanting to see policy that are holistic and taking into account not just their specific jurisdiction, but the broader ecosystem of how we're approaching this work.
Absolutely. Well, maybe let's spend a few minutes here talking about what actually were the issues that we worked on and what happened on them. Uh, Bran, let's start with you. Any particular kind of like maybe under the radar thing that folks might not have been immediately aware of that you want to like lift up?
Yeah, I think I want to name, because I don't know that this was in the news a ton, because it's always the big legislative context, but, there was two PUC commissioners confirmed, Audrey Partridge and Huiquan Ham, and, enabling that regulatory process. There's a lot of work we do that, the outline is set in the legislation, but then enacting it and actually, where the rubber meets the road, happens in those spaces. And we have some excellent policy staff working in that area. But that solidifies. We sent in letters of support for both of these candidates, and they were ultimately approved by the Senate. And it happened really quickly. I remember it was like again another one of those less than 24 hours notice. And I remember watching it, and I was in the gallery, and Commissioner Hom was sitting there, and somebody said congratulations to him, and I overheard him go, I thought it might take a lot longer than this. And so but it was a really cool moment where it's like it's solidifying really good people, very smart people in these positions, that we don't something we don't have to fight over. It's done, and it's in place, and those are appointments from Governor Walz. So it was a pretty cool win.
That definitely. And those are 6-year terms. So that's like a pretty long runway of additional high quality decision making that's going to be happening in our regulatory process. So that's a great one. So I maybe to keep us moving here, I want to ask you about an issue that did not fly under the radar this session, at least in energy spaces, and that's uh, policy questions around the growth of data centers in Minnesota. So these are the very large, largely AI driven facilities that are owned by, large tech companies that you've heard of, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon. And they're springing up around the country, and there's economic development potential with those, but there's also some policy trade-offs and some things that policymakers need to be really attentive to from just a public benefit and public cost perspective. Bryn, can you tell us a little bit about how this conversation like showed up and played out at the legislature this year?
Yeah, I think it sort of started from a specific site, and really sort of bubbled up into the need, and we advocated for this too, to have a larger holistic policy, because our role, it has been and continues to be that we ensure that our energy systems as a whole in the energy transition are not harmed, and that we can leverage and advantage new technologies such as data centers. And when those things change, these are happening. So how do we protect and safeguard, what we work on, while navigating like the realities of like an ever-changing economy? I think that's something we're good at, and there's going to be new and emerging industries through our lifetime. There will continue to be, and this is one of those moments. But every single time, and an industry changes, and we need to think about things new and differently, we will adapt. And I think that's the foundation that we're looking at when we talk about data centers. It's not just about this one project or this thing. It's looking forward 10 and 20 and 50 years, and knowing that we're shaping the world for that. And today it's data centers. In the next couple of years, it could be something else that we still need to fit into our mission and vision, of a carbon-free future.
And with data centers too, it's a new issue kind of coming up in Minnesota, but we're at such an advantage because other states have seen the proliferation of these data centers at such scale for years prior to us. So I think that gives us a lot of information to work off of and be able to see how have these, you know, data centers and the impacts they have on the energy system, how has that been implemented effectively? How has, it maybe taken into some community concerns in a more robust way? So we have such an opportunity to create, an industry around this and work with this industry in a way that is going to be beneficial and in line with our mission at Fresh Energy, because we've been able to watch and learn from how other states have approached this issue for the last several years.
So there's another issue that was got some attention at the legislature this year that I would maybe put into the bucket of emerging technology and related considerations, and that's sustainable aviation fuel. So here at Fresh Energy, we do a lot of work around electrification, trying to electrify different end uses across the economy. But there are certain applications that are just going to be a lot harder to figure out how to do that. And an obvious one of those is the aviation sector. So sustainable aviation fuel, it's a blanket term that can mean a lot of things to different people. It, in its essence, just means lower carbon intensity jet fuel, frequently produced from either biofuels, biofeedstocks, or green hydrogen. But just like with data centers, there's some interesting policy trade-offs and questions that need to be answered, and an interesting cast of characters working on it. So what was the legislative discussion on SAF like this year?
Yeah, a lot of interest in this, from the governor's office on down. But prior to session, I think it's important to name that, Fresh Energy developed core principles for engaging in, we call it SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, with several key partners. And we've stuck by those, continued to center public interest and guarding against, sort of greenwashing and making, sustainability trade-offs. And we helped build out, we're helping build out what could be this new industry for Minnesota. I think, there's only a couple lines in a bill that could then end up being like really impactful. And I know, the tax bill has not passed yet. That's still something unresolved, going into special session, but advocating for, that additional incentive for, the lower your carbon intensity score, you get a little bit more of a tax credit. And, there's some more details in that, but that's kind of the gist of it, of like how you can kind of really dig into the details and make sure that in these sort of emerging industries that we're grabbing for creative solutions and ways to, grow an industry in a responsible and sustainable way.
Absolutely. It's an enormous economic opportunity, but anytime we're talking about biofuels or changes to, even indirectly changes to agriculture policy, there's ripple effects from that. There's political ripple effects, and then there's literal ripple effects on the landscape that we have to think about. And I know you mentioned our partners, which are Friends of the Mississippi River and the Nature Conservancy, and we're really grateful for the partnership that we've had with those two groups working on SAF this year. Good example of the partnership work we do across our portfolio of issues at Fresh Energy. So one of the we made a couple of references in our conversation today to these sort of big wins we had in 2023 and 2024. One of our 2024 wins was a new program to provide some resources to local units of government that want to build geothermal projects. And that you might sort of be like, that seems like very oddly specific, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Local governments tend to have larger, older buildings that are ripe for energy infrastructure investments. You have the opportunity to leverage public money and then capture the savings from reduced energy costs. You have a lot of local governments that are trying to figure out how to implement their own climate action planning. So there's a lot of actually reasons why this little program made a lot of sense, and as it turns out, it's been really successful. So, what's happening with geothermal planning grants? I seem to recall maybe it came up again this year.
Yeah. So, I think some other level setting is we saw that um, the amount of applicants who applied for the geothermal planning grants that came out of the bill passed last biennium, it was twice the demand as what was allocated. So we know that cities are super interested. This is another great example of like there's such momentum for clean energy, and geothermal is just such an excellent technology and such a good example of that. So we were able to, take that momentum, see the need, and be able to advocate for additional money into this program, and an amount of money that would meet the need. So we advocated to have it in the Senate bill this year. Incredible progress and momentum. It's was largely a House provision and interest of the House project. So getting it in the Senate omnibus was a huge win. And again, another one of these things that's unresolved right now. But the fact that it is in both, it is of interest to members of both parties, and the Senate bill has that in there. So it's alive, and we'll see what happens during special session, but call back to our action alerts. That's why we still have these up, because these things are still moving, and legislators still want to hear that this stuff is important. I think I also want to shout out Abby Finnis, who helped corral a group of local governments. I think when we had the hearing, there was about 13 municipalities and local units of government saying they want and they need this, and another 10 organizations that were in support. So it was a huge showing. I think geothermal was a bit of a hot topic. There was some really good projects that were talked about this legislative session as well. Am I forgetting any, Jackson, or is there a couple more?
Yeah, there were a couple. The day we had our first hearing in the House, we were on sort of a slate of bills focused on geothermal energy systems. We had some funding for implementing geothermal systems into public schools. I think the one everyone really perked up at was the Minnesota Zoo was looking, Minnesota Como Zoo was looking for um, funding to transition the energy system for their big cat enclosure to a geothermal energy system. And it sounds like they're apparently wanting to move like all of their energy to geothermal at the Como Zoo. So we could have like the nation's first geothermal energy zoo at this rate.
Starting with the big cats.
Yeah, it's gotta start flashy for people, right?
Yeah, that one actually also is in the Senate omnibus bill. So big cats getting geothermal still alive.
Well, I'm not going to tell my cat, or he's going to want it. He's going to want it too. Gotta no
Cats
love
for
for the
geothermal.
no love for the little cats. Um, well, let's I think we can't leave the discussion of this legislative session without talking about what I think from a fresh energy perspective we would call defense. So we, uh, talked about the significant number of wins we had over the last couple of years and the overall trend in Minnesota being so promising. That doesn't mean there haven't been attempts to, make some changes during this legislative session. What, Brennan Jackson, what are some of the things that you all worked on this year that were really maybe more about, protecting rather than trying to get something new?
I think the biggest bucket of things was, as we talked about, transportation financing and policy. The one thing that comes up is EV fees. It's difficult politically, because I think there's been legislators talking about raising um, fees on electric vehicles for years. So this is where we had to get creative in our advocacy, and aim to at least make things more equitable and sort of at times, do some harm reduction. We definitely showed up quite a bit. I know our colleague Nick wrote a blog post about this. Also, Jackson, how many times did we testify at the hearings? Like this just kind of kept coming up.
It felt innumerable at times. I would imagine, EV fees, it probably accounted for a third of just our testimony in general this year. It was a huge point of conversation just with members, seeing how that conversation has really evolved over time, especially in a year with some other larger conversations going on, that maybe using EVs was a little bit of a chance to give somewhere on some of these issues. But I think transportation defense in general was such a focus of our work this year, not only on EV fees, but, funding for Metro Transit and making sure that we have really strong public transit networks, making sure people are able to get to and from work, to, kids, just enjoying life, and supporting those other transportation uses. And we also saw some bills looking to repeal really successful programs like the e-bike rebates, wanting to make sure people can access these various forms of transportation, these lower carbon forms of transportation. And we showed up to defend these programs. We worked on opportunities to even strengthen these programs, make them more equitable, make sure that all Minnesotans are able to access these various, opportunities and government supports that we're putting into programming. So there was a lot of work in defending transportation resources across the board, EVs being a huge part of it, but also there is broader conversation on how we're supporting our transportation system in general.
Yeah, it felt like a lot of that happened early in session too. Like the first few weeks, it was, like another one of those like 24-hour turnaround. Like who can be there, move very quickly, get our testimony in. Another highlight was defending the impact assessment, the greenhouse gas emission studies, and that's a process to help identify and quantify greenhouse gas emissions associated with certain aspects of the transportation sector, can help inform future decision making and really like quantify those like that the carbon intensity of different modes. Really useful information for us to have, and a delay in that is, kind of, it doesn't make much sense, especially because the departments were ready to roll this out. So, that's another thing that we defended. And transportation, another thing unresolved. So, I, live to fight another day on some of these. But yeah, are we missing anything else on transportation?
I mean, I think when we're talking about transportation, right, it's hard. It's important work to our mission for Minnesota, but it's also in a broader context of some other really difficult decisions that lawmakers have to make this year, right? We have Human Services has to cut millions of dollars from their budget. That's folks on disability services and home care, and really important, not to say our work also isn't important, but really day-to-day life or death kind of services that are being provided. And so transportation work might be a little bit of a compromise area when there are some really pressing budget cuts that have to be made in some other areas. But I think though there might be some compromise there, there was also a lot of, I think, opportunity to show up with our partners as defenders on some of these really big issues. I know the 100% defense was a really big one. Bryn, I don't know if you were really engaged on that this year,
Yeah,
I know.
that was, that was that's the landmark legislation. So if, any attempts to roll that back, this, coming from Fresh Energy, right? The gloves are kind of off, So we saw multiple attempts to sort of an interesting way approach to this to classify certain, you know, certain fuels, certain technologies as carbon free, and they're just objectively not. Thinking B100 and biomass. So the 100% legislation is our path to get to 100% clean electricity by 2040. And it is specifically, the legislation is written to be technology neutral so that every technology needs to meet these standards. So going into those conversations where there's cherry picking certain technologies to say that they're carbon free didn't make sense to us, doesn't make sense in the larger context of the legislation and where we're going. And I think we successfully were able to help advocate for particularly two problematic provisions to be taken out. And right now, I think we're feeling pretty good about that. That's energy is unresolved, and there's still things to work on, but those items existed in the Senate omnibus bill, and at this point are not present in either energy bills as we go into such a special session. So extremely proud of our work there. I think that was another one of those days where we had dozens of conversations with legislators in like a 24-hour period with a handful of other partners. There's like a big spreadsheet, and it was like talk to every single person you can, across party lines, and turn on the Action Network. People were here. I would go talk to members, and they were like, "Yeah, we've gotten a lot of like emails on this. Like, we are hearing from people." So it was a really cool moment to be like, you have this tight window of like 1 or 2 days, and it was felt at the Capitol, and we were hearing that feedback from legislators. So really proud that we were able to keep that intact, and continue our progress on getting towards 100% clean electricity.
So at some point, the session will actually end, and we'll turn the page, and we'll fairly quickly here at Fresh Energy start thinking about what does the next session look like. I know that's maybe not what our Capitol folks want to hear at this exact moment, but it is going to happen. So I'm wondering, maybe as we kind of close out our conversation today, if the two of you have any thoughts you want to share about what 2026 might look like, what's going to happen after this wonderful session finally gets put to bed.
Well, I think it's a good reminder that everything that we're working on is a longer arc. Nothing is a 1 year sprint. And we are playing the long game, and a lot of what we've built this year will carry into the next, metaphorically, but also bills, we're in a biennium, so like all of the bills that have been introduced will carry over into next session, and stuff that wasn't taken up still has the opportunity to be taken up when it comes to policy. Probably not so much on the finance side, but except for when it comes to bonding. And I think Jackson, I know you know a lot about that
Yeah,
timeline and how that plays out.
yeah. So normally in Minnesota, since we're on a biennium structure, our first year of the biennium, so this year, 2025, is focused on setting a state budget. And the second year of the biennium, so 2026, is a lot more policy focused, but the big spending during that year is typically the bonding bill, which is money that is supporting community projects. If a community needs renovations on their community center, or big one in Minnesota is always like something for the town's ice arena or something like that. really supporting a lot of these local projects, and that typically happens during the second year of a biennium. The bonding chairs will go on a tour around the state to look at all these projects, identify, where the need really is throughout the state. And a really important piece of the bonding conversation is the fact that a bonding bill requires 3/5 majority in order to pass. So regardless of who is in the majority on a given year, you're always going to need that across the aisle support to get those things over the finish line. And sometimes that can be a really great showing of folks working together, or sometimes parties will use it as a bargaining chip and, withholding votes on bonding in order to get maybe some of their other priorities across the finish line. So it's a really impactful piece of legislation for the communities, but it can also be a process that is sometimes held up because of some politicking.
Yeah, well said. I think one of those projects that, we're working on and looking forward to continuing the arc of is the White Earth Tribal and Community College Trade Center that we sort of started our work on, started our advocacy, and knowing that probably the best opportunity for that project to be funded is in a bonding year. So we kind of really socialize the idea and explain the merits of the project to these legislators and hopefully looking forward to sticking the landing in the upcoming bonding bill. So and again, just to remind people of that project, I believe it's somewhere around a $13 million trade center in Menominee, Minnesota, at the White Earth Tribal and Community College that would train and it would be part of workforce development for folks who are actually doing the labor of what it would take to bring us into that energy transition. We need more electricians, we need more HVAC installers, we need more plumbers to do all of this. And President Anna Shepard has really been an incredible leader and advocate for that project. So we're looking forward to continuing the work there.
Absolutely. It's a great project, and I think representative of the kinds of things that we're really working hard to do here at Fresh Energy. Well, thank you both for the conversation today. I hope folks listening enjoyed it as well. As we kind of wrap up our discussion, any final thoughts from either of you? Hot takes on the date that will be done with the session, perhaps?
One thing I've probably said it through the course of this podcast, but want to say it even more explicitly that in narrow margins, it just magnifies other people's input and impact. So, being part of the Action Network, having those messages come through, literally, we're 100 to 101 is the political split. So every call, every message that folks send to their legislators, every partnership just seems to have a magnified and outsized impact. And it matters when you show up, and it's great to be surrounded by so many people who are really focused on the mission. So makes me feel like really optimistic about where we're going, even if sometimes the day to day feels like a little bit of a grind, and you get lost in some of the politicking, but the big picture is bright.
For sure. I mean, I came on with Fresh Energy at the same time as the broader policy team was growing, and I think we've really been able to effectively utilize everyone's skill sets and knowledge in these topic areas and deploy them at the Capitol and in those conversations with members and partner organizations. And I think that, no pun intended, the energy within the organization is really felt, and being able to carry that into the future feels really powerful. And just there's a lot of, I think, just great work that is coming down the pipeline from Fresh Energy and our partners across the board.
Well, thanks. Thank you again. Really appreciate our conversation today, and just want to lift up what wonderful colleagues both of you have been this year. And thanks so much for persevering through a challenging, eventful session, and really look forward to taking a break here, and hopefully things wrap up and you all get a chance to rest and recover a bit. So with that, I want to thank everyone listening at home for subscribing to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. You can stay up to date on Fresh Energy's work at fresh-energy.org or follow us on social media. Head to our website for the latest news from Fresh Energy, to make a donation, and register for upcoming events. Speaking of events, we hope you can join us on July 15th for the Fresh Frolic, our all-electric party at the Trailhead at Theodore Wirth Park. It's going to be an absolute blast. Our communications and development teams do a great job putting together our events, and we're really grateful for them. Thank you to the band Palm Psalm for providing our theme song, DGAF, off their album Otuhaka. Get the latest from the band at palmpsalm.com. Thanks so much for tuning in.